Hello and welcome to episode 238 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we have quite a bit to talk about after really discussing over the past week or so that we might not have a show this weekend if nothing really drops. We've had quite a bit of reports. We've had some confirmed roster moves and some very interesting reported and rumored moves on the horizon. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. Like you said, I think it's been a mix of a little. I wouldn't say surprise is the right word that I'm thinking of here. It's been, I mean, the way it kind of happened over the last couple of days has been interesting, but it felt like there were a lot of teams that needed to make moves, and then right after the last tournament, there just wasn't a ton coming out, and it was like, okay, our team's actually going to really stand pat and not make some moves, make some stuff happen. But now it seems to be heating up a little bit with matches literally starting back up in 5 days. So we got some good stuff to talk about now. Not a lot confirmed though, so we'll be discussing some stuff that might change over the next couple days. But hopefully by the time we are live for our next show, we'll have most of the rosters either like fully reported or, in a perfect world, they'll all be confirmed by then.
Yeah, let's not get our hopes up about that, but we do. I think we have to start with the Gentlemates and G2 Minnesota because this is one of the most interesting developments of the season, especially in terms of roster changes. Because, and I was just talking to you in the pre-show briefly, and I asked you when was the last time there was actually a trade. Not necessarily like sometimes it's happened where we've had a team on or a player on team A and a player on team B, and they basically swap teams, but they actually weren't traded for each other. They just kind of, swapped wives, so to speak. Here we actually might get a trade, which would be the first trade in CDL history, I believe. I can't remember one off the top of my head, and the last one that we could both remember was Gunless for Clayster, and that was in IW, so that would have been in, 2018, 2017, so that's, nearly a decade ago now that those players would have been traded between E United and FaZe Clan. And now we might have something similar here with G2 and Paris, where Paris will reportedly, according to Ronnie Intel, is interested in trading for Estreal from Minnesota, and Minnesota would receive Envoy in exchange. And so I'll just read briefly what Ronnie wrote about in his article. You can go check it out on breakingpoint.gg. He said the situation is evolving quickly with teams negotiating to secure the best deals for themselves. And they said we can confirm that G2 is also interested in Boston Breach player Nastie, but they are not the only team pursuing him, as at least one other organization is in the mix. And he called it potentially the biggest midseason trade in CDL history, which is, it's not hyperbole if it's the only midseason trade that we've seen in CDL history. But what do you make of all of this? Because when I was discussing, potential additions for Paris, and we've said for both of these teams that they had to make a roster change, that they weren't in a position, either one of them, to stand pat and allow themselves to go into the Major Four qualifiers with no changes to their roster. And when I was talking about that, I mentioned Estreal as a potential solution for some of Paris's issues. I didn't know if that was realistic, if G2 would obviously part ways with one of, if not their best player. This seems like maybe a win-win for both of them. How do you feel about this potential trade?
Yeah, so initially the reports came out that it was going to be Nasty that Gentlemates were targeting to replace Envoy, and then Sib was going to have to move to an SMG. And I think Sib is capable of being a full-time SMG if necessary. I think especially in this current meta where the NPC is kind of like it's not really a do-it-all gun as much as the Dravik in terms of like the range of kills, but the NPC is like a melt machine, and I feel like Sib would be more than capable of doing it. How effective he would have been in transitioning from like a full time AR ish to uh, a full time SMG, that's another question entirely. But Now this report comes out, and especially from a role standpoint, I definitely like this move for Gentlemates to get Estreal. I mean, you can argue it's probably the best team or roster Estreal's had around him. So, um, in that sense, maybe it brings out the best in him and helps elevate his play to a new level. But it does seem like there are a lot of working pieces here, so I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But in terms of the actual aspect of a trade happening here between G2 and Gentlemates, I really like this idea for both teams. And as you asked, I do think it could be a win-win. I think it is. I think it is pretty obvious that both teams needed to make a change, and in that sense, it gives both teams like a little bit of a fresh start. I also think Envoy has arguably played some of his best Call of Duty in this NPC meta, and obviously that would be debated just because they won Major 1, so even if he wasn't putting up numbers compared to what he is right now, like he still won an event previously, so that's obviously up for debate in that regard. But in terms of his impact on the map individually, I just feel like he's like from an eye test, he's done better recently with the NPC, so it's possible switching him to a different team could even, give him a fresh start and help him out as well. But in terms of the trade aspect of it that I was mentioning to you before we started recording, um, assuming that Estreal was on a basic contract with Minnesota, he was on Minnesota last year. They decided to build around him for this season. He was most likely on one of those like 1+1 deals, or whatever the phrasing is nowadays. He was most likely going to be an unrestricted free agent after this season, considering the fact that he was on Minnesota last year and he was on them this year, and most players aren't on more than 2-year contracts at most. So in that sense, I like this, and that what I said from like a business standpoint, it makes sense to try and trade away a potentially expiring contract. Although it's different than in like sports and like baseball, where you could potentially get draft picks or prospects in return from trading away an expiring contract. That's obviously not involved here. Um, but just like the ideology behind the move, I think I actually am a fan of, even though it might seem weird to be like, yes, I like G2 getting rid of Estreal from a pure like COD standpoint and stuff. I think that's like just looking at the in-game impact and everything he has had for G2. I don't like the move in that sense for them, but like business wise, I think it makes sense if that contract situation is as it would seem from the outside looking in. And like I said, I think for G2, they get Envoy over there. Um, and I think maybe Envoy has been playing better recently. This could help him out, help G2 get a fresh start. And yeah, I think a lot hinges on how this all actually happens, especially the Nastie component. If Nastie goes to G2, I think I actually kind of do like that situation for G2. I obviously I still think people would immediately be like, I don't know how Skies is surviving this roster mania, but I do think with Skies and Envoy in S&D, even though we talked about it last episode, Skies didn't have the best S&D event statistically at Major 3. Like Skies and Envoy, when you think of them as players throughout their careers, they are known as good S&D players historically. Kremp has been pretty solid in really all the modes, obviously, but he's been pretty solid in S&D over the years too. Um, so that's a pretty interesting team for G2, and I think it's a rare situation, like you said. We can't even really think of any COD trades, let alone CDL trades, outside of Clayster for Gunless back in the day. Um, that this could be a rare situation where it does work out for both teams, and if that does happen, does that set the precedent in terms of like other trades? Like, does this lead to other teams considering making trades down the road too?
Yeah, I wonder if that gunless Clayster trade scared some teams off from doing trades themselves, because it worked out for E United eventually. It wasn't a very immediate thing because they had to go a few years down the road, and then they finally won the playoffs, and then they won champs, of course. But it wasn't like an immediate turnaround, and of course, it just simply didn't work out with Gunless and FaZe. Rickus Morty said roster lock is tomorrow, so we should know things very soon. Mates getting Estreal makes more sense than getting Nasty and moving Sib to SMG. And I think that my trepidation about this trade is more so on the G2 side, and it is what you touched on, that getting rid of Estreal and bringing in Envoy, I think, is a downgrade for Minnesota, and not necessarily severely. I don't think that Envoy is trash or anything, but I do believe that Estreal is the better player, and I would be more inclined to keep him on any roster than Envoy. And so I feel like if, and I said this in the pre-show, that if it was Estreal and Nasty, so you keep Estreal and then you trade or sign or whatever, however you get Nasty, and you bring him into the roster, I feel like a lot more comfortable with that roster and just having those two players on the team than bringing Envoy in and potentially keeping Skies. Again, like, I just can't, I can't really understand that logic, to be honest, because, and we were talking, like, if Minnesota could somehow get Nasty, of course, then you would just kind of slot him in and replace Skies, and then see if you could work it out in that way, and then maybe replace Mamba as well. Like, there are a lot of things that you can do to improve this roster, and I thought that would be a great first step, but then it's kind of like you take a step forward and you take a step back, and I'm not sure how much ground they would actually make up if they bring in Envoy in place of Estreal and then keep Skies on top of that. Rickus Morty said in the YouTube chat, but if mates are sending cash and Envoy to G2, then G2 take that cash and buy Nasty. That's a net positive, in my opinion. It really depends, because they're not in my opinion, they're not in, factually, they are not in danger of really missing champs. If they do, then something disastrous has gone on, and Carolina has somehow went from 9th place into the top 8 and made up a ton of ground in 5-6 weeks. So I just think, what is the goal here for Minnesota? Is it something like you said, long-term, or more like, hey, we're kind of moving the contracts around that is maybe more favorable to us financially, or gives us more flexibility in the offseason, which I completely understand if that is the logic. But if it is to try to compete and try to make a good push for champs and then EWC, then I think that isn't the route that they should go down. It shouldn't be to push Estreal out and give him to Paris, no matter what the circumstances are. Because again, it's just like Envoy isn't going to do it. Envoy isn't going to take this team from where they are, which is a very middle of the pack, mediocre team, to some kind of championship contender. And not saying that Estreal remaining will turn them into that, but I just don't believe that they can make that leap if they are also watching Estreal go out the door. Rick Samori said Mamba was really bad. Nasty is elite in comparison. I think the gap between Estreal and Envoy is way smaller than Nasty and Mamba. I agree with the gap between Nasty and Mamba, but I just think that Estreal is the better player, and I think he would fit better, obviously, just with what Minnesota is doing. But if we're looking at it from the opposite side, I believe that adding Estreal in place of Envoy is a really great move for Paris, and that's something that should be applauded from the Genomates perspective, is that if they're able to upgrade at that spot, then I think that makes them better. I don't know if it completely negates all of the really horrible play that they've had over the last 3 or 4 months, but I think it helps at least. Again, that would also be another team that I would say, if you could add Estreal and Nasty and make a 2-person change, I would be open to that. I would be understanding if you replace both Sib and Envoy in that team and see how things work out. I do wonder, although, just to kind of wrap it up, at least in my thoughts about this, is like, we've seen Ghosty and Envoy get really close to each other, and how Ghosty has been very protective about Envoy in general, it seems, in the, when people kind of talk shit about him. I wonder how this kind of plays into his mindset about, duos have a really weird relationship with each other at times, and it doesn't seem like maybe they're the most compatible in terms of play style, but it does seem like they get along really well, and they've been teaming for multiple years now. So I wonder how this will all work out with Envoy. Potentially, obviously, we'll see what happens officially with all of this, but it does seem like he's leaving, and how Ghosty kind of reacts and plays without Envoy by his side. How do you view this? I guess, obviously, we've talked about G2 and where they kind of go from here, but like, what is the ceiling of either of these teams if this trade goes through? And I think we should mention that it seems like if Envoy goes into the roster for G2, then it would probably be with Nasty, and then obviously potentially keep Skies and Kremp. So like, how do you view that roster? And then on the flip side, Paris adding Estreal instead of Envoy, and where they can go with this role swap.
I think the G2 evaluation does definitely hinge on them getting Nasty as well. Especially, they did drop Mamba, or no, Mamba hasn't been officially dropped, but he's been linked to reports for Surge. So there is definitely still a lot of moving pieces there. I can't, like, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, like, if in a world where Nasty doesn't go to G2 and then the team is something like Skies, Mamba, Kremp, and Envoy, I would be worried about that team, because we highlighted last episode really how Mamba and Skies were struggling last event, and Estreal and Kremp were just basically lights out. So then you're in effect, if that's the only move, you're getting rid of one of your better players and replacing him with one of the weaker players on Gentle Mates, even though, like I said, I have been encouraged by some of the signs I've seen from Envoy recently. But regardless, assuming the roster is Nasty, Skies, Envoy, and Kremp, I think I think I like the team more than the roster they had previously. I do think there still will be some issues in terms of keeping up and slaying in some departments, especially, or in some matchups. If Skies and Envoy are having the off games that they've been prone to recently, they could struggle in respawns. But like I said, those guys are known for search. If they can figure out a system in search with this new squad, that could be their road to victory. I know that's kind of worrying as well, because Minnesota has been known in recent years to get to a lot of game fives, but just not be able to cross the finish line. So, being a search team when you've had historical issues recently in those game fives isn't a great recipe for success. But nonetheless, I do think if the trade goes through, purely like in the server talk, not thinking of any of the other aspects of it, I do like the move for Gentlemates. Rickus Morty does bring up a good point, though. Like I said, I have been one of the one of the people recently who I felt like with Gentlemates, that Envoy, similar to Skies with G2, he was just the name that was going to be highlighted and looked at with the most scrutiny, and be like, yeah, we got to get rid of this guy to change the team. And while that could be true, I don't think that, like with G2, I don't think Skies was the sole reason why G2 were struggling at times. And for Gentlemates, I don't think Envoy was the sole reason that Gentlemates had been struggling recently. So I'm not sure. I definitely think Estreal has the potential to be a good upgrade for Gentlemates. And like we were talking earlier, I think bringing in Estreal to be that sub player, keeping Sib on a flex versus the unknown of him being a full-time sub, which is just something we haven't seen from him yet. Even though I think he could be capable of it, I don't know what that looks like, and that would have been definitely something I would be looking towards seeing whenever his first match would be, if that happened. But doesn't sound like that's going to be the case. So I am excited to see what both these new rosters, and like we were saying, I do think that it could turn out to be a win-win for both teams. But that obviously is going to have to depend on how these players play. Like, we can sit here and talk about all this stuff on paper, and then it just something falls flat, chemistry issues, yada yada. So we'll have to wait and see.
I believe also something that we haven't talked about, or I haven't really seen discussed elsewhere, is that Vios is the current head coach of Paris, and I believe he was the head coach of LAG when Estreal was a rookie, if I'm not mistaken, when they put together that roster that Enable pretty infamously panned and then got called out for and all of that. But I believe that there's some kind of connection there, so that would make sense at least why Estreal in particular would be targeted by the Genomates and why he'd be brought into this team. I don't know if this is like really what's going to fix it, to your point that I don't know if Envoy is like the boogeyman and that he needed to go, that he was kind of a black hole, and that replacing him will fix all the issues that have been plaguing Paris over the past 3 or 4 months. At the same point, though, they needed to make a change, and to your point again is that Envoy was just the easiest one to get rid of, and we've talked about this with some other teams as well, Optic in particular, that like if they were to make a move, like who's the first one that's going to go? And I think we all agree that it's Hook, because he's been dropped before, and once you've been dropped before, it makes it a lot easier to drop you again. And Envoy has moved around teams a few times, including from LAT to Toronto and all of that. And granted, it hasn't always been he's being dropped, but he's moved rosters enough, and it doesn't seem that his reputation is such that he's not untouchable in the CDL. Whereas Ghosty, for example, he might be more untouchable, or he might be a little bit harder to move in that regard, because people I think relatively highly of him, like to Rickus Morty's and what he said Ghosty doesn't strike me as a good teammate, and I believe that there's probably some truth to that, but at the same point is like the talent is there and it's really undeniable, and we've spoken about this before. I don't know if it was in particular with Ghosty. I think it might have been honestly with Paris and all of that early in the season, is that when people say like you're a bad teammate or you're toxic or the personalities won't work in this team, that shit just doesn't matter until you start losing, and then it matters like completely. But like when you're winning, nobody cares at all, and that's just something that people talk about, and that doesn't make it right or wrong, obviously, because like it could be the reason for their downfall is the personalities at play and some of the issues that they're running into. But I just simply don't I don't know if Envoy is going to be the guy to turn around G2. I don't know if he's going to be, going out the door, if he's going to be the reason that Paris is going to start winning. But I just agree that Paris is making an upgrade here if they get Estreal for Envoy. How Sib will do with some kind of role swap or whatever, I have no idea if that actually comes to pass. I don't fully believe in him as a player just in general, and this team has just not given us any kind of inclination as to like why they're doing so bad, and if they're able to actually turn it around this late in the season at such a pivotal point in the year. With G2, I just don't believe in them. I even if they make this change, I think we'll both get to the point of like they have to prove that they're different than they were, and getting rid of your best player does not necessarily make me think that you're any different than what they've shown this entire season, aside from a few wins against FaZe at different points of the year. Rickus Morty said in the YouTube chat, he said, I don't think it's because Hook has been dropped before is the reason why. It's because Dashy, Shotzi, and Merc are more talented than Hook is why. Well, yeah, to that, I agree to an extent, but if Shotzi is underperforming and Dashy is underperforming, Optic is a lot more hesitant to drop those guys than they would be to drop Hook if he had the same kind of performance. And then you said, but it's important how you act when you're losing. If you act toxic when you're losing, you may never win again. Sure, and I agree with that. But at the same point, like we've seen so many players who I would consider to be very, very toxic players get opportunity after opportunity after opportunity because they're talented. And if you have enough talent, sometimes that can override whether you're a good teammate or how good of a teammate you are. I mean, if you look at the Optic Dynasty guys, I think individually some of those guys, Crimsix is relatively toxic, but nobody can deny that he's one of the greatest Call of Duty players of all time. And he's been, I think, in part kind of the downfall of some of his teams at the very end because he contributes to that environment. I mean, we both love Aches, but I don't think that there's any arguing that at times he can be a very toxic player. So, those things, again, if you're winning and your team is okay with that, or they can sustain your personality, that's what it comes down to, is that you have this kind of ecosystem that can support your toxicity to an extent. You can't be like the worst person in the world. You can't be like a dictator probably and get away with it unless you're like Scump or just like the very, very best player of all time. Like you can't probably get away with that very much, but I just believe that your toxicity can always be enabled and accepted if you have a certain level of play that you get to consistently. And I think that's what we're seeing here with not just him, but like a lot of this Paris roster. There's quite a bit with that, and I don't think that it was undeserved by any means. But also they won Major One, so I think there's a lot of good things that came out of that, at least early in the season, and we'll see if making this change, if it goes through, makes any difference in the end. I think we should move on unless you had anything else on Gentlemates or G2, because like you mentioned, Mamba seems like he's on the way out of Minnesota, and it appears that he's going to land with the Vancouver Surge. It has not been made official, but the Surge did officially announce the release of Gwinn this week, which that was basically the first time, or the first roster move that had actually been confirmed and that we knew we were going to be able to talk about. I guess before we get to what they might do with this roster, the Surge, how do you feel about them releasing Gwinn, who I think we both agreed when they picked him up last offseason that was a win. That was a huge pickup for Vancouver, and we were very excited about his potential with this team. And now, not even at the end of the season, he's on the sideline, or not even on the sidelines. He's out of the league essentially, and he's probably going to be in challengers to finish the season. So how do you feel about Vancouver officially dropping Gwinn?
Yeah, I think this is probably a move that just had to happen, just due to the fact that they've tried so many different things with Gwinn this year. I'm pretty sure he started the year as a flex, and
Yep.
I don't think he went to. No, he didn't go to main AR, because that's Lunars has been main AR. But obviously, like early in the year, there were a lot of games where there was just 8 ARs on the map at one time. So he was using the AR probably more than he possibly had in previous titles, and then just recently they switch him to the SMG, and that coincides with I'm pretty sure, based on the timing of he would have moved to the SMG after they got rid of Capsule, which I think would have been in in conjunction with the NPC swap from the Dravic, but nonetheless, like they've tried a bunch of stuff with Gwinn. It just wasn't working out. I think this might be for the best for him individually in the long term. Because I think he's a guy who's going to just go down to challengers and absolutely fry right away. Like, the guy was Rookie of the Year for a reason, and obviously there were, people who debated that and thought Abuza should be Rookie of the Year over him and all that, yada yada.
Mm-hmm.
But even in a world where he's like second in Rookie of the Year, he's still like been one of the best young players to come into the league, seemingly out of nowhere. Obviously, if you're thinking of that, Merc is probably at the top of the list. But in terms of somebody who you probably didn't hear a ton about when they were first inserted into the league, and then his rise up, it's been pretty fun to watch. He's just had a lot of issues with teams, finding team success and stuff like that. And there've been the Gwinternet memes and stuff like that. So there's been a lot of question marks around him. But I think if he goes down to challengers and he just absolutely fries, like we've seen some other former CDL pros do, I think that could bode well for him, and especially in a world where he gets on a good team in challengers now and potentially gets to EWC and gets to play against Vancouver EWC. Like, that would be pretty fun to watch. But I think really it's kind of like the Snoopy thing. Like, obviously very different situations, but there were, the whole slasher conversation around thinking Snoopy needed more time in challengers, and he's gone down the challengers just recently, and he's been doing pretty well for himself individually and with his team since that transition. So I think it's pretty apparent that there are some guys who just they might have, uh, you know, some individual moments here and there where they're struggling in the CDL, but then they go down and they play against challengers level talent, and it's like, okay, yeah, these guys are clearly, a step above these guys that they're playing against regularly. We'll obviously have to see if that's the case with Gwinn, but I have a very strong feeling that would be the case. We'll just have to wait and see. Um, for Vancouver, I mean, I don't really know how much this will end up changing things for them. I think it's really just a play for EWC at this point, because they're basically out of champs. I don't see them, even if they like absolutely fry in the Major Four qualifiers, I don't see them like having a big impact on Major Four itself. But that could be like a good tune-up, or however you want to phrase it, ahead of EWC for them. So we'll have to wait and see how everything plays out for them.
Yeah, these bottom teams, I think maybe even Carolina included, despite them having the best chance of the bottom four to actually make champs, that they should take Major Four as kind of like the only land practice that they'll have before EWC. And because there isn't a major gap between Major Four and, I guess there's a gap between Major Four and champs, and so there's a decent gap, but like at least you would have some kind of idea of how your team plays when you are actually on land, if you're able to go to Major Four with this team, and then obviously have like a month of practice with that specific roster. But yeah, I don't love it. Of course, I think that Vancouver has done one of the worst jobs in recent memory about constructing their roster and sticking to a legitimate and specific philosophy with their roster construction, because we talked so much about it in the offseason when the rumors, and obviously when it was confirmed that they were picking up this really young, inexperienced team, that they'd have to let them fail, that they'd have to just basically throw them in the water and see if they sink or swim. And if they sank, then you can make a roster change and you can kind of figure things out from there. But what they did is they got very antsy, and I don't know if they were expecting a lot of success, or especially from Legend. And of course he played awful. Like, he was one of the worst players in the CDL. At the same point, is like, he never played competitive Call of Duty before. He was a Halo player. Let him sink like for at least a month, let him sink for 2 months, and then make that roster change. And I still think that they failed him as an organization in that regard. But then to Gwynn's point, in his specific case, I think they failed him as well, because what he was asked to do this season was not what he had been asked to do very much previously in Carolina or his brief stint with C9. And I believe that they just did not know exactly what to do with these players, that they didn't know how to kind of put them in the best position to succeed. And that's unfortunate, because it really just kind of wasted Gwinn a year. Like, he should be on a good team, or at least, like, even if he was on Minnesota, for example, I think that would be an interesting place for him to be, because they're in competitive matches consistently. They're able to win at least some of those matches, despite, failing a lot of times. But that would be more of an interesting place for him than Vancouver, like we've said, who has no shot at making it to champs, no matter what happens in the Major Four qualifiers, in the minor, and at Major Four. And then you get to what he's going to do in challengers. And I think he's probably, because he has all these CDL points and teams will kind of move mountains for him, he could probably do something he's more comfortable doing and probably better at doing. And I'm interested to see how that actually works out for him, if he's able to kind of get some of the mojo back that he had in previous years, versus like what's been happening this year. And you brought up Abuza, because obviously we had the comparison between Gwinn and Abuza during their rookie years, but like, he was a pretty good example of, he was playing out of position. He was in a different role than he had been comfortable with in that first year with Vancouver. And then mid-season, they were like, okay, we need to actually change this, because we need to get him in a place that actually fits him better than what we've been asking him to do. And we saw it last year. We've seen it this year with him on FaZe. When he is in that kind of position, when he feels good, he can be a very, very good player, and his teams can be very, very good as well. And I don't know if Gwinn has that potential. I don't know if he's going to be like an MVP caliber player, which is very rare just in general. But I think he could be like a pretty solid player on a good team. Like I think he could be at times kind of like Neptune. Like Neptune obviously last year was pretty incredible, and I don't know if he's going to be able to replicate that on a consistent basis, but we've seen this year he's a very good player, and his team can be very good as well. Granted, they haven't been recently, but I don't know how much that actually has to do with him. But I think Gwinn could kind of fit in that mold, and I hope that starting next season and maybe impressing some teams and challengers for a month or whatever it is. Maybe he gets onto a CDL roster when we go to EWC, and maybe there's some kind of interest there, or maybe just kind of showing what he can do in EWC will be a wake up call for some of these other CDL teams to kind of find him a place in their operation. But yeah, I just don't. I think in general, Vancouver has been a complete failure with what's going on this entire season. And I hope that they can rectify some of this stuff next season or EWC. Rick Morty said, Gwinn has always been a loser in the CDL, though. Rumor has it he doesn't care about winning. When has Gwinn ever won in the league? But I would argue that is the case for 95% of players. If you're not on Optic Phase, LAT, or Paris, you've probably never won anything in your entire career, and you might never win anything. So, like, I don't, like, what has Estreal ever won in his career? What has Joe Deceives won in his career? Like, these are players that I think we all agree are very good players, and they can actually be competitive. But I think when you're a young player, you tend to get stuck or saddled with either non-competitive teams or just completely dysfunctional teams. Like, you might be competitive in one moment and not competitive in the next. And I think that's where Gwinn has found himself. You know, I'm not saying that he's some like MVP caliber player. I don't know if he's going to be Simper or Beasy. I would highly doubt that. But there are a lot of players that have come into the league and they just simply don't get put in the right position or can't find themselves in the right position. And I think he is certainly one of those players. Well, I mean, you're saying Florida has won. The Florida Mutineers, who are extinct now, won in 2020 when 8 teams went to a home series event. You know, like LAG won an event where the GAs were all busted and they didn't even make champs the rest of the year. So, like, I mean, if you want to make the argument, I would say that, like, he's only been in the league, 3 years, I believe, and he was on Carolina for 2 of those years. Carolina, just in general, has been a dumpster fire for however long. Like, they can't even afford for anybody to make a graphic for their organization. So for them to be competitive, no matter how well Gwinn plays, I think that's pretty, you know, like that's not a great argument. And then he went to C9 for, I believe it was EWC last year, if I'm not mistaken. Then he's been on Vancouver. Like, these teams are dysfunctional. I don't think they're dysfunctional because of Gwinn, which would be really impressive if he was somehow like poison to a lot of these organizations. I just simply don't accept that as a reality. I think that he could be better. I don't know what his options were. I don't know how many teams were looking at him, but I certainly think that he is a much better player than the team results would indicate over the past 2 or 3 seasons. That's what I would say. How do you feel about just in general where Vancouver is going, though, Bink? Because what I guess the plan is obviously getting rid of Gwinn. That's actually official. But it seems like what they're going to do is replace him, and they're going to bring in Mamba and Craze. Obviously, Mamba coming from Minnesota, Craze coming from Carolina. They were teammates, if I'm not mistaken, in Challengers last year, and we had this discussion about whether they would go to the same team. It does seem like it's going to be Mamba Craze, TJ Nero. How do you kind of feel about that Surge roster? Obviously not for champs because they won't get there, but for EWC and maybe next season as kind of a building block.
Yeah, I didn't think of it until you just said it, but there were the reports early in the offseason last year, I think, that or this past offseason that I'm pretty sure it was Surge was looking to sign that Omit team from EWC that was like Mac, Vivid, Craze, and Mamba. Um, although I think that Craze and Mamba have not had the impact in the CDL that some people likely hoped they were going to have right away, I do think that there is something to be said about, reuniting them and potentially seeing if that works. I think they really have nothing to lose in that sense. Like if they pick them up and Vancouver continues to struggle, it's like, okay, well, that's just par for the course. Then we squad wipe in the off season and start fresh. But like you said, it's possible that like if they reunite them and one or both of them uh, hits a new form or plays better in some sense, maybe they could be a part of what the team is looking to do next season. I still would tend to think that, especially since they're building around Lunars right now, seemingly, like it would feel like they would maybe keep him and try to build around him elsewhere in the offseason too. So not entirely sure if this is a move that really moves the needle for me, but I do think it's interesting that seemingly TJ is on the way out. It doesn't sound like he is like involved in any of these other moves, so that could be, an interesting domino to fall. Maybe him and Gwinn do something in challengers together, because even before this year they had the experience with Carolina. Obviously TJ had the experience earlier this year with the Bush, so if any of like the Bush changes, then TJ could have a shot going back there. But I wouldn't be surprised if Gwinn and TJ did something together in challengers. I'm not really sure who else they would play alongside, but um, I think, yeah, this is basically a lost season for Vancouver. They might, kind of as you alluded to, they might just be throwing a couple darts at the dartboard, seeing if anything is worth sticking with Mamba and Craze. And then in the off season, I mean, there's a possibility Vancouver might not even be in the CDL next year, right? So um, I don't know. I don't think there's much more to really say, other than this is just like a Hail Mary to see if they can make something happen at UWC. I'm not particularly inspired by this move or anything like that, but I guess to try and be a little positive, we did see Mamba and Craze do, not terrible at EWC last year on that omit team, and obviously that was a big part of them getting their name out there and being considered for these CDL spots to begin this season. And maybe that's like, restarting of the cycle if they're able to show out this year as well.
Yeah, I believe that probably the best outcome, like obviously that is realistic, is probably them to get like top 8 at EWC if everything goes according to plan, like getting out of groups and maybe winning a match, or maybe getting top 12 or whatever. Like I just don't see them having like a great chance of success once they actually get to EWC, no matter what their roster is. Like they just haven't looked good enough like at any point in the season. I think they might have had like 1 week where they went 2-0, where they won 2 matches in 3, and we thought, okay, maybe something is changing here, but I just don't actually see that coming to pass. But I'm interested to see how Lunars kind of does, and if he is worthy of like building around with this roster. I think this season has been not as bad as it was with LAG last year, but it certainly hasn't been great for him the first 2 seasons that he's been in the CDL, that he's been on a really bad LAG team and then a pretty bad Vancouver team back to back. And I don't know if that'll do him very well when we get to the off season and potentially is a free agent, or has to kind of deal with whatever Vancouver kind of cooks up over there and what roster they make for next season. But I guess we will see. I think we should also discuss Carolina in the same vein, because obviously Craze is potentially going to Vancouver, and that would mean that he's not on Carolina anymore. He was officially released by the Royal Ravens this week and replaced by Standy. I think we should all just mention that they used AI for his release image, and then when they announced that Standy was being signed, they did actually have an official graphic, but that was because somebody who's like Standy's boy made the graphic, and Carolina just used it. So it's going great with the Carolina Royal Ravens and all of that. How do you feel about this move for the Ravens with Craze going out and Standy, who's been out of the CDL for a bit now, coming back in?
Yeah, I honestly had to go back and look it up because I was like, in the back of my head, I was like, was this the last time? Or sorry, I had to go back and check to see if the last time Standy was in the CDL was that like Toronto situation where like Scrap basically said like he was a bad teammate or whatever, and then they dropped him, picked up Pixie, and immediately won a tournament and all that stuff. But he did have a stint on one of the Legion teams. I can't remember if it was Paris or Vegas Legion, and then he most notably finished that 2024 MW3 season with the Minnesota squad that was accuracy, lens, and gunless, which definitely is a team of all time that did not stick in my memory. But still, it has been a bit since Standy was in the CDL. So I'm definitely happy for him on an individual basis. Similar to Surge, though, I just don't know how this really like moves the needle for Carolina. I still think this team is just gonna be on the outside looking in, even though they are technically the team that has the most realistic shot of causing some like late season chaos for the champs race. I just don't think it's gonna happen, and I just think it's a situation here where Standy in particular, unless he truly believes that Carolina does have a shot to make CDL champs, this is kind of comparable to that like Boston situation a couple years ago, or I think it was a couple years ago now, when we talked about like Major Maniac joining at the end of the season, and like he's not going to be able to compete at Challengers champs, and he's taking a risk joining a team in Boston that most likely won't be at champs. That's kind of how this plays out, unless they just like Carolina, for quite frankly, they got to win Minor 4 or Minor 2, whatever they're numbering it.
Yeah.
They got to win the minor, go like 4-1 with a very, very tough qualifier schedule, and then get like top 3 minimum at the major to have a realistic shot of qualifying for champs. And I just don't see that happening, regardless of what roster move they made and regardless of how the team plays after this change. So I purely individually, I'm happy for Standy, and I hope he is viewing this as an opportunity where he's able to showcase who he is now as a player and a teammate, and potentially try to get a spot for next year, because I don't know how much this, depending on how he was doing in Challengers and stuff like that, like he could be missing out on a good chunk of change if he had a shot to compete at Challengers champs. But maybe it's a situation too, like I keep on, I don't think discrediting is the word I'm looking for, but like not really factoring in EWC in that prize pool there, where players could just be like he gets a guaranteed shot to compete at EWC, which has a big prize pool no matter what. And if he stayed in Challengers, there's a chance he doesn't qualify for the tournament. So that could be a factor here as well. But end of the day, I don't see this move changing much for the team, but I'm happy for Standy.
Yeah, I think it's more just the stability that comes with the CDL, at least the relative stability, because we know from the reports that it isn't as stable with like C9 and Carolina and all those teams that are kind of on the bottom end and like really not paying their players or not treating their players to the way that you would certainly expect of a CDL team. But like you're still in the CDL. To your point, they can go to Major 4, they can get some money, they can go to the minor and potentially get some money. I mean, they're not going to get any money. They're definitely not going to get like a top 4 finish at, or I think you need to finish, I think it's first place.
Minor's just first.
Yeah, so they're definitely not getting money at the minor. And then, maybe they do get some money out of the EWC, but so I think it's that, like, you get to be on these big stages and you get to be seen as well. You get to be kind of like seen as a CDL player, and sometimes that helps, like not even from like a like a personal perspective, but certainly from a professional perspective, to be back on the stage. I just said it a little bit ago, but like when you've been dropped, it's a lot easier to be dropped again. And I think when you're in the CDL and people see you in the CDL, it's a lot easier to get picked up because you're not like a risk in that regard. Like, we've seen players like, I don't want to say like Afro in particular, but Afro's been a lot of teams, and like at a certain point, or TJ, for example, obviously like he seems like he's on the way out, but he's been on like half of the CDL rosters at this point. And I think part of that is because he's been on so many of these other teams, it's not necessarily seen as like a huge leap of faith for these organizations to bring him in. He's seen as more of kind of like a proven commodity to a certain extent. And I think maybe Standy could get some of that rub in the meantime with Carolina. But yeah, like if we're just talking about the CDL season, which is obviously like our main focus, they have no shot. And even if he performs, nearly as well, or they have this honeymoon period that they had when Exceed came into the team, it just doesn't seem like they're going to be able to kind of make up the ground that they would need to get into champs and, really make a difference at the end of the season. But they could make things interesting. They could be spoilers for some of these other teams. They could kind of wreak havoc, which is always fun. And I think very much welcomed by the Ego Chall podcast. We like the havoc. We like havoc, Colt Havoc, but we also like the havoc as well. But yeah, I'm interested to actually see if he can stay in the CDL because he had such a bright future when he came in with that Minnesota team, and of course they won the major, I believe, that season.
The Minnesota Miracle.
Yeah, and he was a big part of it. So I'm interested to see if that can kind of. That would be crazy if they actually won the major in the same way, but just for him to stick around the CDL because he does seem like a pretty cool guy and like he has a personality, which is always, again, welcomed in the CDL. But yeah, I just don't see it actually making a huge difference when it comes to the gameplay and how things kind of shake out for Carolina the rest of the season. We'll shift gears though real quick because C9 was also, we should just kind of wrap up on these bottom tier teams because they were pretty much the only teams that seemed to make a change aside from like the G2 Genomates thing. But C9 officially announced the release of Ocus, and it seems like they're going to add an 18-year-old player. I believe you mentioned him earlier in the season. It's Wevy. I'm not sure exactly how to say it, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but there's been a lot of talk about this guy just in general, and I forget what the context was when you brought him up earlier in the season, like what team that might have been, because I remember screwing up his name or potentially screwing up his name earlier in the year, but he seems like a potential replacement for Ocus in this lineup. Of course, C9 is completely dead in the water. I don't know if they're even, like, they might technically have a chance to make champs. I'm not sure if they mathematically been eliminated, but it's very close. They have 3 wins on the season, I believe. They just they can't win respawns consistently. I think they finally won a respawn this past weekend, or I guess 2 weekends ago at the major, but otherwise have just been completely irrelevant in the CDL this year. And we haven't really discussed it much, but they are on pace to be one of, if not the worst CDL team in history, which I think we'll have to check the tape, but they're getting close to kind of that Boston Breach, Paris Legion area, and that's very dangerous waters. But what do you think about this potential move? Obviously, Ocus is confirmed to be out, so we know he's not going to be here, but potentially getting replaced by 18-year-old Wevy.
Yeah, Wevy, I'm pretty sure.
Wevy. So I fucked it up twice. There's just no way. But yeah, how do you feel about that?
I honestly think this is one of the rare situations where the whole, like, we've talked about it numerous times now, but like the salary situation with Cloud9 and stuff has been pretty messed up. But in Wevy's case, yeah, we talked about him. I just went back in the notes and looked it up. Episode 234, if you want to go back and listen to when we talked about him for the first time, because that's when the Bush announced their second roster, which was the Shrub, and that team was Arcides, ASIM, Skill. I'm pretty sure it was just Skill is Skil, and then Wevy. And Skill and Wevy were the 2 players who they weren't even they were 17. They weren't 18 yet when they got picked up by the Shrub for this upcoming event, and this was literally their first event at the Major 3 Challengers portion of the tournament. I just think that when it's somebody like that who literally just became eligible to compete, he's obviously like 18 years old. He's not thinking about the monetary aspect of it. He just wants to play pro COD and showcase what he can do. And this is a rare situation where it can kind of be like it can kind of slide under the radar a little bit. Obviously, it would be different if he had very lucrative offers or a lot of teams were reaching out to get him. It was actually Skill who the Bush mentioned at the time that he had already received substitute offers before he turned 18. But now, Wevy is getting a shot here. And I do think in this case, it's a situation where, yeah, the salary is not going to be ideal and everything like that. But for the next couple months, he'll just technically get a shot to be a pro player and showcase what he can do. I obviously don't think this changes much for Cloud9, and I think that's been my talking point around Cloud9 for this whole roster has just been like in the position they're in and the money they are being paid. You want to play on an individual basis and showcase what you can do individually. And I hated saying that every time I've used this conversation, and I hate saying it now because I truly do believe in like the team aspect of Call of Duty and everything like that. But in some situations you gotta do what's in your own best interest. And for like Wevy here, I think he's just got to go out there and try and show what he can do and potentially try and increase his stock heading into next year. And, like I said, kid literally just turned 18 before this last event. So, he most likely wasn't on a ton of teams' radars, even if he was on a few teams. But now just getting this opportunity to play on Cloud9, everybody is going to at least have heard of him now heading into the following off season. And that at the very minimum sets him up. Again, he's in a situation where even though Cloud9 aren't going to be a champs, he'll be at EWC playing for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Cloud9 probably isn't going to factor into that majority portion of the prize pool. But if he just stayed in Challengers, there's a chance that, yeah, he could make some noise in Challengers, but he might miss some of those biggest events in Challengers and not even get to qualify for EWC. So I'm excited to see what he can do. From a team basis, though, like I said, don't think it changes much for Cloud9, but I do think individually will be interesting to see how he plays. And Okus was just like consistently highlighted as one of the, everybody on Cloud9 struggled a lot, but Okus seemed to struggle quite frequently for them. So I guess this is a minor W for Cloud9, even though there are definitely multiple strings attached to that statement.
I will play devil's advocate here, and I will take the position that I actually kind of believe that Wevy should not sign with a dogshit organization, even for a short-term period, because let's say that he signs with C9 and he goes through the Major 4 qualifiers, Minor 2, he goes to Major 4, and then that's it. And obviously EWC. Let's say C9 continues to do just as poorly as they have been doing. Does that help his stock when it comes to July? And let's say he's a free agent regardless. Like we say that he signs a 2-month deal just to kind of finish out the season, but he doesn't sign like a long-term deal, which I think be kind of death for a young player to sign with C9, especially because you have no idea what they're going to do with their roster next season. But let's say that he signs a 2-month deal, and let's say they don't do well, that he does fine. I don't even know what would be good in this scenario if they're not doing well. But like, let's say he has like a 1.0 KD or like a 1.03 or something. Like, I don't know how much that actually helps his stock and what people think of him. And I think what he should be looking at is kind of like, do people want to pay me more because I was on C9, or do they want to pay me just the same or less? Because I really think that what he should be doing is kind of pumping up what he is. And if you have to go kill whore in challengers and you have to go help some team finish top 16 at the challengers open like he did this weekend, I think that's fine, because that kind of builds up like what people expect of you, and then you can kind of cash in next season. And Rickus Morty said it hurts his development, screw his stock. I mean, of course, like the development is one thing, but I don't know how much of his development, especially with like the specific team that he's on right now, like how much that does for his development into a CDL player. Because I think sometimes it takes actually being with a bunch of former CDL players to kind of get up to speed and really develop as a CDL player or a CDL level player. So I'm not entirely sure about like whether he will develop or whether it will stunt his growth. But like what I would look at if I'm like his manager or if I'm like a friend, and I look at kind of just like, will you actually be better off if you go to C9 for a month or 2 months? I would certainly not think so. I think it is the Major Maniac thing, which is a little bit different, obviously, because he was near the end of his career, but I certainly don't think that it helped him. I don't think that people looked at him any differently or looked at him any better once they got to the offseason, despite him certainly not being the reason that the Boston Breach were doing so bad, because they were doing bad before, and they were doing bad with him. I think they did pretty poorly after him. So I don't think it really hurt him too much in that regard, but it certainly didn't help him. And I just don't think that it would be in his benefit to go with a bad team. If this was a good team, and he could kind of come into our Mercules where you can kind of walk in and it's a Toronto Koi. It's like, all right, like I know these are good players. I know that they should be relatively competitive. And if I can kind of slot in, even if I'm not great, even if I'm not making the biggest impact, I could always think that like, yeah, we could do something and people think highly of me for it. If he was getting offered by LA, not LA, I was going to say LAG because we'd knock in LAG a little bit, but Paris, if he was offered obviously by Paris, say, yeah. If even Minnesota, sure. Like Falcons, I'm cool with all of these teams. But then when you're kind of looking at Carolina, or if you're looking at Vancouver or C9, or Boston, I would say, all right, like let's really think about like the long-term implications of this. Are you just better off being in challengers and maybe getting into EWC as a challengers player and not being judged as a CDL player? Because I think there is a little bit of that going on. Like he will be seen as like instead of being a top tier challengers player, he will be seen as like a mid tier CDL player right out of the gate because he's maybe not ready for that responsibility. I wonder how you kind of feel about that, because we've seen obviously like Hydra, for example, like talent wise, he was certainly up to par, but like the communication and the teamwork, I think he needed to be brought up to speed before he came into the CDL, despite having all of the talent that we've seen him kind of cash in on over the years.
Yeah, I don't know what the plans were for like the Shrub roster and everything beyond this event if Wevy didn't get this opportunity, but obviously he was playing alongside Arcides and ASIM, and Priesta was coaching that team. So you could definitely argue if they were sticking together that would be a better situation for him to learn more from than the current players on Cloud9 and the coaching staff there. At the same time, you could argue he'd be playing against better talent with this Cloud9 roster than he would be in Challengers. So I think it's a bit of a two-way street there. I'm not entirely sure. Again, like if the Shrub was just like a one event thing and they were all going their separate ways, then I think it's kind of a moot point there. But if they were planning on sticking together and then he goes to this Cloud9 situation, I do think you could argue it might have been better for him to stick with the Shrub squad in terms of what's best for his individual development. But I also think this is a very short-term opportunity, it seems like to me. You mentioned it and I didn't say it at first. If he signed some kind of like contract for beyond the season with Cloud9 at the current rates that we're hearing being offered salary-wise for these players, then that is an all-time terrible decision on his part. Like if this is only for the next couple months, I got no problem with him trying to shoot a shot. And like I said, that's how I view it is, you mentioned Toronto. It seems very likely Toronto isn't making a change, but, you know, if he comes in here and fries maybe for EWC, if Toronto struggles at champs and major four, like if Wevy's playing well, Toronto made a change last year for EWC, right? When they brought in Abe just for that event, maybe they give Wevy gets a shot on a better CDL team for EWC than that even is a better financial situation in terms of the prize pool. Like I already said, being on the Cloud9 team opens that doorway to having a shot at some money, even if it's not a great shot. Then if he plays well in these couple matches beforehand, gets on a better team, he's got an even better shot at a better payday at EWC. So I think there are definitely multiple ways of looking at this. I do think in terms of his development, you could argue for sure that the Cloud9 situation isn't the greatest, but I think as an 18-year-old kid, kind of looking at him as like an unmolded piece of clay or whatever, and I feel like Cloud9 can only do so much damage to him, and some team would be able to, you know, remold him very quickly if he is this like next up-and-coming talent that some people are considering him to be. But we'll definitely have to see how it works out if he is officially added.
Rickus Morty said it's going to be hard to get on a good team, but the bare minimum should be a competent team. And I think that's the right point, that C9 is wholly incompetent. They have proven that time and time again. And I worry that it's obviously not the same because this player has been on the team for most of the season now. But we had a similar conversation about Encourage when he was debating about going to C9 or staying in Challengers. And I believe it was Ben J who was kind of advising him a little bit when he was making that decision. And Ben J said something to effect of like, they're paying you so little that I would say pass on this opportunity. That like, I understand why you want to take it. I know that you want to be a CDL player, that you want this opportunity to kind of prove yourself on the biggest stage. But at this point, like the offer is so bad and so uncompetitive with what other CDL teams are typically going to offer you that I think you should pass on this, and hopefully you'll get another deal or another offer down the road. And of course, Encourage took it, and we discussed like why he would, and it made complete sense from what we assume is his point of view, and that is to be a CDL player and to hopefully continue to be a CDL player and not be just a Challengers player, and especially because he had kind of quit and came back, and it seemed like there was quite a bit of consternation with like how he was, how his career was going, even though he's like super young, obviously. But I do wonder, now that we're almost at the end of the season, of course, Encourage is still on this team, but do we think that he's any better off moving forward in the CDL now that he's been on C9? Or has this been kind of hurtful for him? Does this kind of affect his long-term career ambitions because he's been on such a bad team and such an incompetent team that people might have this kind of belief that he is part of that incompetence, that or that he is the reason or a big reason why this team isn't winning? You know, like I just don't want that obviously to happen to any young player. I don't want Wevy to come into this team and only be there for a month or 2 months and people to come away from this and be like, well, look, Wevy's obviously not the guy. Like he's not the superstar player that we expected him to be. Kind of like Lunars, to be honest, last season, because Lunars had so much hype coming in to the CDL from Challengers, and then it just didn't work out. Like he just didn't have this the season that he or anybody really wanted. And then he comes into this year, and I think he's probably only going to be on like a handful of teams. Like there wasn't a lot of clamoring for Lunars in free agency, and he ends up on another team that's just really incompetent, and it kind of creates the cycle that I don't think he should want to fall into. And I think it's just easier for him to wait it out. Like as much as that is kind of antithetical to like being a competitor, trying to really just be the best, at times I think you have to take a step back and look at like what is long-term the best decision for me. And if I was advising him, I would say, unless they're offering you a shitload of money to kind of like offset some of these issues that we've been talking about, I would not be okay with you going to C9 of all places. I just think that like that particular team or that particular kind of team is a problem, and you're not going to be able to solve that problem. So I would say wait, go in maybe when teams start making roster changes for EWC, like you said, maybe if Toronto wanted to make a change or the Falcons potentially wanted to make a change, one of these other teams, maybe then you kind of strike while the iron is hot and you get into one of those rosters and you feel more comfortable about it going to EWC. But I just don't think that him going to C9 would actually help his career. I think it could have a negative impact, at least short term, on what he wants to accomplish. I think that about does it. I don't know if you had anything else to talk about. We're at like an hour and 50. I guess one more thing about, we were kind of on the Challengers thing or Challengers adjacent at this point, but the Huntsmen announced earlier this week that they were benching Swooty, who we had talked about a little bit on the show, in place of Awakening. So Big Wake being added to the Huntsmen, which is Optic's Challengers team. I saw there was quite a bit of backlash about this, at least relative to Challengers rosters. I don't think that they're necessarily the most well-known events and all of that, but it did seem like there was just kind of frustration with the Huntsmen for doing this, because they had pretty much said, hey, we want to bring up these new guys, these young guys, give them a chance to experience it together and give them this platform. And obviously Big Wake is just not, he doesn't fit that mold. He's been in the CDL at least off and on for 5-6 years at this point. So he is a well-known player and certainly a good player. And, I think he might end up in the CDL again at some point. But how do you feel about this move for the Huntsmen to push out Swooty, a young player, for Awakening, a much more proven former CDL player?
Yeah, I think most of this came down to pro points based on what was being said by Methods in the announcement video and whatnot, but I think that is kind of interesting that, like, it seemed like at first Optic was saying they wanted to go this route of go the opposite route kind of that we've seen them go down now, where it's like they started out by giving non-proven players a chance, and now they're kind of like doing what they can to just put together a good team to try and win the upcoming events, which, I mean, they obviously have every right to do that. It's just obviously a shift in philosophy that some people are unhappy with, but I think end of the day it is, it's a good opportunity for Awakening. Obviously he's not like the most outspoken person or not like a great content person or anything like that, but maybe this is what like helps him get to that level on an individual basis and sets him up better for like his career down the road and all that. I do think it's interesting. There was some rumors, this is not reported in any way, but Zuma and Methods were talking about potentially Renegade being an option for Gentlemates in place of Envoy. I think that would be super interesting. I don't know if I like that more than the potential Estreal trade or anything like that, but it's like the fact that it's even rumored is sort of interesting, and how that would impact this Huntsman situation, because it doesn't sound like Huntsman like fully dropped Swooty. It sounded like in the announcement video Method said something like he's sticking around to still do stuff, so maybe they're like holding on to Swooty, anticipating Renegades might get another option. Again, that is definitely the least confirmed of anything we've talked about today, though, because that hasn't even been reported. That's just rumored from a clip I saw of the Zuma and Methods talking on stream. But if they're even talking about it, even if they're just like joking and stuff, that means it's at least being considered behind the scene, and that's at least an interesting conversation, because we saw earlier this year the legend move for a former pro Halo player didn't work out, and maybe Renegades can show the other side of that coin and have more success. But I think if it does happen, I would be shocked in terms of like it seems like the Estreal trade is more likely than just Renegade going in to fill in for Envoy. But there are a few based on the struggles of Gentlemates, what I'm about to say doesn't make a ton of sense. But from a pure like talent perspective, like Renegade getting his first CDL opportunity to play alongside Sib, Ghosty, and Neptune, like purely talent-wise, that is a pretty strong scenario to be in. Obviously, with the chemistry stuff and all that, you could definitely argue that like Merc was in a better situation last year, obviously, but it would be very hard to find a better situation from a pure talent perspective than what could happen if Renegades actually is being considered as an option for Gentlemates.
I think that's a good place to leave it. We will be back hopefully on Wednesday to talk about hopefully a lot of confirmed roster changes. I know that isn't something that we're entirely used to here on the Ego Chall podcast, but sometimes it's worked out for us and not very many times, but I hope that we can actually have some more conversations about the rosters, and we're planned on doing power rankings, so that would be even more helpful. If we have to go in blind, we will, but that's not ideal. But yeah, we'll be back on Wednesday to do power rankings, to do our final power rankings update of the regular season, and talk about all the roster changes. And then we will also preview the first week's matches of the Major 4 qualifiers, which begin next Friday. Pick 'em. As it stands going into the Major 4 qualifiers, you are 143 and 74, and I'm 144 and 73, and Trimmer is still winless. Please like, subscribe, follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, as well as YouTube. You can watch the live stream of the podcast or the VOD of the podcast on either YouTube or at twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can also follow and subscribe to Bink on Twitch, twitch.tv/JBink with 2Ks. Follow us both on Twitter at JBink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and the podcast Twitter's at Ego Chall Podcast. Very much appreciate Rickus Morty's in the YouTube chat for sticking with us throughout the entire show. Really good conversations about some of these roster changes, and man, I think it's getting exciting because we have to go through the slog of qualifier matches every season, and they feel very pointless at times, and especially because of those Major 2 qualifiers this season. But now we actually have some matches coming up that feel very, very important. Even if we don't get one of those bottom 4 teams to kind of make a run, the seeding still matters. We have a 3-way tie from 6, 7, and 8. So obviously that's very important. We could see some shuffling near the top as well with Optic and LAT and FaZe and Toronto and all of them. So a lot of interesting matches to come up, and certainly one of my favorite times of the year, and I'm looking forward to talking more about all of it. But that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for all the support. Shout out Rickus Morty, like Preston said, hanging with the boys and giving us plenty of extra stuff to talk about. And I don't got much to add, honestly. I think it's going to be exciting once some of this stuff is actually confirmed. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a report within the next hour that would have been interesting for us to talk about. But, as is Ego Chall tradition, it'll probably happen in, just a little bit, and then we'll talk about it on the next show. But, yeah, I do think despite some of the teams that we were talking about today being those lower teams in the standings, I do think there were some exciting moves to talk about, and coincidentally those were obviously the Gentlemates G2 stuff is probably the most intriguing, just because of that whole aspect of it actually being a trade for potentially the first time in CDL history. So exciting time. We'll have more to talk about hopefully on the ROSTERMANIA front next week, and like Preston said, got power rankings, more matches coming up to preview, and all that good stuff, and we're right back in the swing of things. So thank you guys as always for all the support and tuning in, and we will see you on the next one. Remember to send the chow.